How did the press lose the Vietnam War? Hello and welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. We are on the 5th chapter of this read-through of Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky, this masterpiece right here. And it is time that we get into the sort of last section of the book, chapters 5 and 6. Chapters 5 and 6 look at the Indochina Wars. Recall that there are 3 Indochina Wars. The first one is between Vietnam and the French. The second one is Vietnam and the US and outlying countries. And the third one is Vietnam and Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. So specifically here, we're looking at the second Indochina War, and that is with Vietnam. And the way they've broken this up is very specific. Chapter 5 is talking just about Vietnam, and then Chapter 6 talks about Laos and Cambodia. And we're going to get more into that in the next lecture. As always, I just wanted to thank you for being here. This is really, really awesome to be able to come here and do this series and have such cool feedback on this stuff. It's been really fantastic to see everybody's comments here on social media and elsewhere, just out in the world. It's really, really awesome to see. So thank you very much for being here and for watching through some of these videos and for reading along with Manufacturing Consent. This is just such a pleasure to be able to do this. Now, if you haven't done so yet, I recommend going through the past few videos. Some of them are pretty short, but the past few videos just to understand where Herman and Chomsky have come from. We've talked a lot about Central America. We've talked about the propaganda model that underpins this entire book, and we've also given a little bit of a historical background. So that intro lecture, I think, is very important for this section of the book, especially since we're going to be running through a lot of history here. And that history I outline in more detail in that intro lecture. And today we're more going to be talking about the analysis than going necessarily like deep diving into the history. So just having that intro lecture kind of in the back pocket as you go through this, I think will be quite helpful. But what else is there to say here? If you grew up like me in the United States or in another major Western country, a lot of the stuff that you find in this chapter may look quite new to you. We think that we learned about the Vietnam War in school. We really don't. There's a completely different perspective here that comes through in this book. And because it was written back in 1988, it's actually quite incomplete. So it's offering you a totally other perspective, and it is extremely worthwhile to read this to get a historical background. The history in this is excellent, and it will take you and give you more information, just what we're missing in the general curriculum when we learn about the Vietnam War. But now, with hindsight, and this video is recorded in 2024, so we have a lot more detail about exactly what went on during this period. So we know, for example, things like more about the extent of the CIA's Phoenix program, which assassinated tens of thousands of presumed sympathizers with North Vietnam in Vietnam. We know more as well about the long-term effects of Agent Orange, which is this chemical compound, this really horrific chemical compound that devastated Vietnam. And we also have declassified records from Operation Rolling Thunder, which gives much more depth and detail to that bombing campaign, where exactly it reached and how much of it was done. Just the scale of Operation Rolling Thunder, we know a lot more about now. And by the way, if I can really quickly recommend an excellent podcast, go listen to the most recent series of Blowback. It's all about Cambodia, and this is just, it's such a good companion piece for Manufacturing Consent because they really go through a lot of that Operation Rolling Thunder, which Herman and Chomsky don't necessarily get into much depth in this book. Now, of course, none of this changes the analysis. If anything, it only sharpens it. We know more about the evil, heinous shit that went down over this period. And so it's important to keep in mind as you read this, there's more to the story. Not that this story is wrong, but there's more to this story. Now, how are we going to break down this chapter? Well, the bulk of this chapter is targeted at this question of, did the media lose the Vietnam War for the United States? This is a claim that people actually still make. I just Googled this beforehand, and there's a Washington Post analysis from 2018 that's titled, "Did the News Media, led by Walter Cronkite, lose the war in Vietnam?" That's the actual headline. And there's good detail in that article, but it entirely misses the point here, and this is what Herman and Chomsky are really digging into in this chapter as well. And there are a few key reports from the time that they're really taking aim at in particular here. So there's an accuracy in media, hour-long television special, the Vietnam op-ed. There are comments by Leonard Sussman at Freedom House and a few Freedom House reports. In fact, one major later Freedom House report that the authors deal with. There are comments from John Corey at the New York Times, and there are a number of articles that keep popping up throughout this chapter that they're very concerned with. The major thrust that these programs and commentators are making is that the media, as they started to highlight how the US was losing the war in Vietnam and a lot of the atrocities that were going on, they managed to sway public opinion away from the Vietnam War, which led to the US's eventual withdrawal from South Vietnam and of course the fall of Saigon, which comes in 1975. And this is something that you hear repeated even now. I remember when I was in high school learning about the Vietnam War, this was absolutely the story that we were told about just public opinion swinging against Vietnam, and so the US's hands were tied and they had to pull out. Now, what Herman and Chomsky say is that that's kind of nonsense. They say that it's not so much the public turning against the Vietnam War, it is that elite opinion itself shifted, and the media just starts to reflect that properly. So Herman and Chomsky are trying to prove in the course of this article, and I think they prove it very successfully, that media opinion really shifts only when elite opinion allows it to shift. Now, even the coverage, and even continuing now, a lot of what we hear is that the intentions of the United States were not bad in Vietnam. If you exist in a bit of a leftist bubble like I do, you will know that that's absurd, but this is still really the dominant narrative. And I would include media just beyond this, beyond the news media. I would include television and movies that are still telling us that the US were the victims in this and that they went in with the best intentions. And sure, there were horrific things done, but the heroes in every case are American soldiers on the ground in South Vietnam trying to protect the South Vietnamese government against the communists that are trying to roll in and take over this country. The media at the time, back in 1988, weren't questioning the intentions of going to protect South Vietnam. What they were questioning was the winnability of the war, and that is how elite consensus shifted on the topic. So the authors say, as far as the media was concerned, the war itself wasn't bad, it was just going badly. And at every point, as we will see, the media followed elite opinion. We're going to break this down roughly into 3 stages. Just like Herman and Chomsky do, we're going to talk about the early stage, so the initial invasion, the atrocities, the My Lai massacre, etc. And then we're going to talk about some crucial events in the middle. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident, for example, the Tet Offensive. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Paris peace talks and the Paris agreement that ends up coming out. And the way that Nixon ends up scuppering the deal, and the way that, of course, was rewritten as a victory for the United States. And crucially, a victory for the United States' bombing campaign. At the end of this video, we'll talk just a little bit about how this chapter still applies in the modern day. And I think you've heard me talk just a little bit about this already, just off the cuff, because this is something that we absolutely still see in the dominant media narrative that we're presented with. Anyway, spoilers for this video, let's dig right in. Let's talk about the early stages. Let's remind ourselves of the history here real quick. First Indochina War takes place, ends in 1954. This is when the French withdraw from Vietnam. And there are all sorts of talks at the UN. These are the Geneva Accords. And in 1954, the Geneva Accords are signed, which allow for no foreign involvement, but Vietnam holds elections and there's a reunification of these countries under the auspices of this UN agreement. And the United States is not interested in this at all. And this is where the authors start, because those accords fall apart entirely because of the US. The political apparatus, we have to remember, in South Vietnam at the time is almost completely invented by the United States. The heads of state in South Vietnam are essentially handpicked by the United States and then toppled. This, of course, happens with Diem early on when he proves insufficiently militaristic for the United States. And so in a CIA-backed coup, he is toppled and removed from power and replaced with the next guy. And it's just a series of this. This is all happening because the US doesn't want, again, a domino to fall in South Vietnam and potentially lead to communism rising throughout the rest of the region. This is the infamous domino theory that we hear again and again. So the US at this point really don't want Vietnam to reunify anything because they have seen the popularity of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, that Ho Chi Minh and others have led so successfully against the French, this resounding victory. It's a hugely popular person who becomes very much a founding father for the new Vietnam, and they're worried, very reasonably, that any kind of reunification process will just sweep South Vietnam into the remit of North Vietnam, that this all turns out to be under the control of Ho Chi Minh in the end. But when you look at the media coverage in this book, as the authors do, what you find is that there's absolutely zero coverage of the US reneging on the Geneva Accords. Instead, all of this just gets framed, again, conveniently, as communism versus the free world. This is the frame, this is the structure that we are handed. And Herman and Chomsky write that the reality during this period was essentially invisible to the American public. So all attempts at negotiating peace were swept under the rug, and you have these reporters flooding into Indochina, and they start to report on atrocities, and they actually start to report on atrocities quite fairly as well, is the weird thing. But, Herman and Chomsky note, they don't really consider them to be atrocities. And there's an absolutely wild quote that demonstrates this on page 193. This is from the New York Times, which is quoting a U.S. official who is describing a B-52 bombing campaign, these strikes in the South. And this official says, quote, "Every single bomb crater is surrounded with bodies, wrecked equipment, and dazed and bleeding men. At one such hole, there were 40 or 50 men, all in green North Vietnamese uniforms, but without their weapons, lying around in an obvious state of shock. We sent in helicopter gunships, which quickly put them out of their misery." This is a really harrowing, really evil quote, and there are a couple things to think about this quote. The first thing is that this is a massacre of unarmed soldiers that is described in the most cavalier of terms. I mean, Herman and Chomsky note that this is a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention, and they're absolutely right. But just beyond this, to put this on the record in a major paper is insane. And then beyond that, when he's saying, North Vietnamese combatants, green North Vietnamese uniforms, that's just him saying that. And we know that the United States, we'll talk a little bit about the My Lai massacre, but we know that the United States throughout this period is just lying left and right to the press. So this is already described as shooting soldiers who are unarmed. We don't know that these soldiers were actually North Vietnamese soldiers at all. What if they were civilians? We genuinely do not know, because this is such a quagmire of information here. And then even when they are sort of reporting on atrocities, these atrocities are frequently framed as necessary casualties. And if that sounds familiar, it really should. Think of every time we see in the media coverage of Israeli strikes on hospitals in Palestine. And I'm recording this in 2024, by the way. So we are still very much embroiled in this atmosphere of, you will see generally, in a lot of major papers, this presented as sort of necessary casualties, as Israel hunting Hamas. And this isn't even the United States doing this. This is an American client state doing this in the region. So things that elsewhere would be described as absolute atrocities get the, well, this is sort of a necessary casualty treatment. Now, Herman and Chomsky do say that there was some controversy around the bombing of dikes to disrupt food supplies for the North Vietnamese. That more ends up being because they're worried about a China and Soviet Union response, and a little bit about how the United States' reputation may suffer on an international level. And the one major exception to all of this is the My Lai massacre. And we do go into more depth of this really, truly horrific event where civilians, just men, women, and children, were massacred. Essentially, an entire village was completely wiped out from top to bottom, burned to the ground. Really horrific accounts of what went down in the My Lai village. We talk a little bit more about that in the introduction lecture, but just have in the back of your mind just how horrific this actually was. And so the My Lai massacre, it did eventually break through into mainstream media coverage, but there are a couple things to note about this. The first thing is that the My Lai massacre happened in June of 1986, but wasn't reported on until a year later because of this very elaborate cover-up, and the cover-up itself became a major story. Then remember that the My Lai massacre is only being picked up by major outlets in an atmosphere of mass protests against the Vietnam War back in the United States, which, by the way, have very little to do with the media coverage. And then there's this really chilling quote on page 197 from a colonel who says that every unit of brigade size has its My Lai hidden someplace. And that really tells you a little bit about the magnitude of the evil going on here that's just getting swept under the rug. My Lai breaks through, but it's only a fraction of the full story. And in fact, it's a fraction of the full story that we know today. We still don't know the extent of how horrific this campaign actually was. But Herman and Chomsky say as well that the way the US was wrestling with the My Lai massacre at the time, especially with all these protests in the background, it becomes a way for the US to allow itself to present itself as a conscientious superpower. You know, this is a country, yes, conducting military operations, yes, conducting a bombing campaign, but worried about stuff like this, worried and trying to prevent things like the My Lai massacre. The fact that the United States is really wrestling with the realities of this, it becomes an opportunity for the US to kind of reframe this discussion. And there's this really fascinating quote on page 198, where the New York Times later writes about an area where inhabitants are being bombarded heavily. So Herman and Chomsky say, the report quotes villagers who accuse the Americans of having killed many people here. They are in no position to appreciate what the name My Lai means to Americans, the reporter adds thoughtfully, which is an insane way to reframe this. So now we've seen a little bit about the early period, and by the way, if you've read this chapter, and I really hope that you do read this chapter, you will notice that we're going quite quickly through what is an extremely dense and very long chapter. I do think it's an incredibly important chapter, probably one of the most important. I think the stuff towards the back end of the book is maybe the real meat of this book, and so absolutely it's important to go through. But just because I'm interested in sort of analyzing and looking at the theory here, there are details that I'm not giving just in the interest of time. However, if you do get a chance, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go in and read this chapter properly and give it the attention that it deserves, because the details here and the quotes that they've pulled from papers are shocking. Right. Next thing, we're going to look at some critical events during the middle period of the conflict. So let's start with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is a U.S. destroyer that entered North Vietnamese territorial waters and gets challenged by patrol boats. This destroyer is there to go spy on the North Vietnamese, and so is very rightly challenged by patrol boats, but the U.S. just kind of spins this as an act of aggression against an innocent monitoring vessel, which is insanity, but the press runs with it. The foreign press, Herman and Chomsky note, do significantly better with challenging the official narrative on this, but it is the American reporters that go full on in just supporting the official line as just yet another act of aggression directly against the United States on behalf of the North Vietnamese. But then we have the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is normally held up as a turning point. Again, the Tet Offensive is an incredibly successful string of surprise attacks that happen across South Vietnam back in 1968. The reporting on the Tet Offensive framed this as a major loss, and this reporting was seen as having gone way too far. This is turning people against the war. So a lot of the criticisms in the early part of this chapter are actually talking more about the Tet Offensive and the reporting afterwards. Because according to a lot of people who are writing and commenting about this, if you report on the reality of the war, which is that this was a major setback for US forces and South Vietnamese forces, of course, that this was a major setback in the Vietnam War, then you're just going to present this as an unwinnable war. And of course, people are going to start taking part in more protests when in fact, you should be enthusiastically supporting the American war effort. Of course, in fact, if you actually look at it, and this is what Herman and Chomsky say, if you look at the actual polling, the Tet Offensive only strengthened the public's resolve to bomb the hell out of them. That's the actual terminology that Herman and Chomsky used. This is the bomb the hell out of them camp that only gets strengthened by the Tet Offensive. In fact, it was the elite opinion that started to turn and start to think maybe this is a war that we can't actually win. So the media, remember media is just going along with the elite consensus in the United States at the time, the story that they're being presented with. The media themselves aren't changing, they're just going along with elite opinion, which is changing. They're starting to view this as potentially unwinnable, this war. Now, Herman and Chomsky say the media overall is still mostly presenting this as a tactical loss somehow for the communists. This is still very much in the pocket of the American military apparatus, but the coverage starts to shift a little bit during the Tet Offensive. All of this brings us to the final part, which is the Paris peace talks. Now, the Paris peace agreement, the October version, when it was first announced, it had two versions, let's say. The first version is the real version, where the government of Vietnam, the GVN or South Vietnam, would agree to reunify with no external interference. Then there was the second version, which was the Henry Kissinger version, which said that the negotiated terms were for the South Vietnamese government to remain in power. That simply wasn't true. But guess which one the media reported? And the U.S. ends up rejecting that October negotiated agreement. Richard Nixon wins re-election, and the U.S. restarts its aggressive bombing campaign. It loses several dozen B-52s, and it ends up accepting later agreement with basically the exact same terms later in January. But the U.S. manages, because of this, to frame this sequence of events as a major victory for the bombing campaign. So essentially, they're saying the U.S. has bombed Vietnam into submission, and the media fully bought into this narrative. Now, after the peace talks, and this point is contested, but it's probably the South Vietnamese that end up breaking this truce agreement that they come to in 1973, acting, of course, with U.S. support and U.S. weapons. But in any case, the North Vietnamese also end up breaking this truce, probably after South Vietnamese aggression, but of course, and they respond with absolutely overwhelming force, which culminates in 1975 with a full-scale offensive and the fall of Saigon. And naturally, of course, the U.S. just frames this as communists violating the agreement, regardless of the violations they themselves committed, and regardless, by the way, of the initial 1954 violation. We're not interested in nuance here. This is not going to be a part of this at all. But again, the press really goes along with this version of North Vietnamese aggression, and of course, we have all the famous images and reporting from the fall of Saigon and what that entailed, and this collapse of this independent republic, which just simply was not the case. Now, of course, we should talk a little bit about the legacy of the Vietnam War, and that's because you've seen this. I've seen this, we've seen this all over the place, and still we see this. The U.S. has somehow managed to frame itself as the victim in the Vietnam War. And if it's not the victim, it's pretty much always the good guy. And it's this major attempt, this very systematic, by the way, attempt to redefine the US and especially the soldiers fighting in Vietnam who did go through hell, obviously, but as victims of North Vietnamese aggression, when in fact it was the US that invaded them in the first place. And Herman and Chomsky quote President Jimmy Carter saying that no debt is owed to the Vietnamese because, quote, the destruction was mutual. Which is an insane quote as well. Just an absolutely bizarre thing to say and a truly wild read on the situation, but is, I think, nonetheless, still the narrative that comes out of this period. And think about this. I mean, really think about this. Think about all the things that you learned back in high school, the way that was framed, all the documentaries that you've watched over the years, all the Hollywood movies that are about Vietnam. I think I can count on one hand the number of actually fairly balanced movies that I've seen about the Vietnam War. And most movies about this period are just generally about American heroism and continue to be. This is still the defining narrative. And we're just at all points kind of steeped in this. It's not gone away, and we have not successfully reinterpreted or reimagined or allowed ourselves to properly understand this history that we have caused. And I'm speaking here directly to Americans because that is what I know, but of course this is a media narrative that you get around the world, although probably not so much in Vietnam. Now, Herman and Chomsky also say, when we're talking about legacy here, that the U.S. only continued its long tradition of trying to destroy the region afterwards. And of course, U.S. involvement doesn't end in the region with Vietnam. It continues into Cambodia. And at one point, the U.S. actually supports and props up the regime of Pol Pot and then tries to define Vietnam as the aggressor in that battle when the North Vietnamese are forced, after several border incursions, I would say, to remove Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge that the U.S. is propping up. But again, the U.S. in the media manages to define Vietnam as the aggressor in this case. And this is Pol Pot. I mean, this is one of history's most evil dictators, one of our like top most evil dictators that we know. Anyway, and it's very easy to sort of sit back and say, well, yes, but now Vietnam is a flourishing country. It is a powerhouse in the region. It is a manufacturing hub. It is a counterweight to Chinese influence, like whatever you want to say. But this quote really struck me. This is from page 245, and this is very near the end of the chapter. It's a little brutal to read, but they say, quote, "The countries of Indochina will be lucky to survive. They will not endanger global order by social and economic success in a framework that denies the West the freedom to exploit, infecting regions beyond as had been feared." And so when we think about success and we think about the webs of capital that now kind of crisscross the world and the global value chains and manufacturing and everything, the success of Vietnam is true, although there are different forms of success, and GDP is not the only measure we have for success, obviously, but in economic terms, it's undeniable that Vietnam is a major success. But it has succeeded in the system that we have built for it. It will succeed because the West is still allowed to exploit in that region. And so this quote from 1988 is just as important now as it was back then. And I want to close just with a couple thoughts about how modern a phenomenon this is. So just very briefly, think about the coverage that you've seen of similar world events. And especially think about the coverage of events where the U.S. is involved directly. Think about things like the Iraq War or the invasion of Afghanistan. It's always the same story, kind of over and over and over again. We always get this. We keep repeating this. We do all the damage. We do the invasion, often for a pretense, and then we frame ourselves as the victims. So the next time you're reading about a foreign conflict, just keep this chapter in the back of your mind. Think about what you're reading. Who does it benefit and how? And then maybe read around a little more. Now, thank you very much, as always, for watching this. I really appreciate you being here. As always, let me know what you think anywhere you like. We'll be back next week to talk about the final chapter of Manufacturing Consent and to close out this book. This is really, really exciting that we've come this far through this book, and the final chapter of this book is certainly, from the perspective of where I'm coming from, when I first read this book many years ago, was the most eye-opening chapter to me, where I was just thinking, I have never heard I was never taught about the vast majority of the stuff that is mentioned in this chapter. And maybe that's on me for not reading around more widely, but I can certainly speak for the American school system when I say that it is bizarre how you never even hear about this. So we will talk about Laos and we will talk about Cambodia next week. And until then, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.